with one guy out of all the people on the highway between here and Brisbane, and he just happened to be the champion of the world boxer. Not shot put, not a high jumper or a runner, but the champion of the world boxer. So the old saying is, don't ever pick on someone you don't know, because it could be a champion of the world.
Exactly.
But Barry didn't all of a sudden then bash the bloke. He just said, mate, here's my autograph, see you later, and have a nice night. But the guy probably had about 3 scotches when he got home.
Yeah, and learnt a huge lesson.
A huge lesson, Drew, So
I've got exactly that story. Exactly that. A guy called, I think his name was Damien Lovelock.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, he went to the Olympics. He actually worked for as a salesman for one day at the shed company, right?
Yeah.
At Titan Garages. But I never met him. He actually he did meet me, but months later, I'm giving, we have this argument on the highway.
Yeah.
And I dead set, I learned a lesson. I was losing my mind at this guy who was actually, he had met me before.
Yeah.
I couldn't see who he was, but I thought he was just up the bum of my car and giving me aggression. But I was just in a bad state. I really was, years and years ago. And calling him over on the road, I'm trying to reach down for a bottle, and that's like the worst situation ever.
Exactly, yeah.
And then when I get 15 minutes down the road, luckily he went to Brisbane and I went down the Logan motorway.
Sure.
Luckily, this was the worst thing I've ever done. And next minute, the sales manager rings me, "You have some trouble there on the way to work, Drew." And I went, "Whoa, no. Who is he? Who was that guy?" And he goes, "Oh, that's Damien. He only worked for one day at Titan because he had to go to the Olympics to fight." I went, "Oh, no." And then I met him. I actually met him. He walked straight into the office for a question, but he was a sweetheart. He just shook my hand and went, "Oh, yeah, mate, like you were," you know what I'm saying? He had his chance to give it to me, not physically, but at least let me know, but he just embarrassed me.
Yeah.
He made me feel just as embarrassed as I was in a nice way. But
I think the lesson to be learned is every time the potential for some sort of an argument develops, consider everyone may be the champion of the world, and that might get it back into its right perspective. Sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, here's my question. How did you get into the boxing? Where did your interest start? Like when and where? Like,
well, Drew, as a kid, we lived out on a farm, as I say, out at Ravensburn outside of Toowoomba. My father was a complete boxing tragic. Loved it. He used to watch the boxing and would stand outside Jimmy Sharman's troop and so forth. And I think the first, there was 6 boys and 2 girls in the family, so we virtually made our own fun. And virtually it was the first present I can remember getting was a little pair of boxing gloves, because that's what Dad loved, and a tennis racket because he had a tennis court. Yeah. But truly, we just boxed together, the elder brothers. I was the second youngest and probably the smallest, so I learned pretty quickly to defend myself.
Right.
I always had this love of boxing, probably through my dad, I'd imagine. And truly, I used to drive a tractor around when I'd come home from school as a primary school kid. And I used to jump on the tractor I always had this wonderful fascination with boxing. And, of course, the champions of the world then were the Joe Louis and the Jersey Joe Walcotts. And I used to drive around in ever-decreasing circles on the tractor doing interviews with these guys because I wanted to be an announcer. And I can imagine people would put up on the side of the road and listen to this kid doing interviews and think there's a weirdo, probably ring the police and say there's some kid out there who's got sunstroke and he's gone mad and he's talking to himself. But I was actually doing interviews with all of these champions. And
can I interrupt? What kind of year would that may have been?
Oh, in the mid-50s and so forth, yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah.
But so
and it was
you were hearing it through the radio?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Right.
I used to sit up and listen to the boxing. There was no
the
TV.
magic of boxing through the radio.
Exactly so, and listen to these guys, and that's what got me involved or interested in becoming an announcer and an interviewer. And that's exactly what I virtually did. And then I came to
Can I ask who was the name, like a boxing announcer you particularly, or do you recall? You know how people's style of announcing have changed, particularly if you were to listen to announcing from the 30s and 40s. Everyone had a different kind of way of speaking. We speak this way now. Yeah.
There was John Dobby from the Brisbane Stadium, and there was I can't think of his name, and from Melbourne, and I just listened to them all, and and picked out bits and pieces that I liked, and pinched a bit of a line from there, and drove around in ever-decreasing circles around the farm, and practiced that. When I came to Brisbane at 16, you could box then as a pro earlier than now it's 18 before you can even have it's a senior fight, and I started boxing, and I had 35 pro fights. not to the stage of world titles and so forth, but, in semi sort of main events in the country towns in Rockhampton. There was Bobby Sin, who was a wonderful little fighter, and I made quite a bit of money out of being Bobby Sin's sparring partner. And not only in the gym, we would go up into country towns and there'd be a big boxing tournament or an amateur tournament, and we would then, as a highlight, do an exhibition with Bobby Sin. And I was getting probably some of the times £80, which you could, the wages were about £10 and so forth. So it was good money to do an exhibition with this great little fighter. But I broke my arm then very badly, and I thought, well, I can't box anymore. And as I say, I never intended to be, I never professed to be a great fighter. You wouldn't want to know, the only fight I had outside a boxing ring and back in Mergen.
Is that right?
Yeah, outside in a little country town.
Just a punch around.
A guy, I suppose, who virtually didn't know because they didn't probably know I was a professional boxer at that stage, and I was about the height of my career doing, 10 rounders in country towns, and went up and there was a guy got into an argument, and the bloke sort of blamed me for being involved, and I said, well, it wasn't me. And so he said, oh, well, out in the backyard. And luckily, a friend of mine sort of said, well, if there's going to be a fight, it's got to be Queensbury rules and a bit of wrestling and this. So luckily, because the guy was about 3 times my size, but he was throwing wild and woolly punches and missed, luckily, with most of them, and I landed a couple and virtually finished up backwards into a rose bush. But I finished up with an arm broken badly in 2 places, and he finished up with a fractured jaw. So it was about dead heat. But my arm never properly healed properly. Right. And Drew, it was probably the best thing that happened because that was the end of my boxing career. Okay. I then started announcing, and I started announcing with Vince Curry on 4BC. I think a few of the listeners would know Vince Curry was probably the greatest race caller of all times on Radio 4BC, and 4BK were the ones doing it on their own, and because it was pretty popular in those days. So Vince and I became the announcers for boxing from the Brisbane, the old festival hall or the new festival hall. Right. And mate, and we
was there a lot of competition? Was that? Well, no doubt that was a great job to get.
There was 4BC, and there was an announcer on that.
They just
station.
Changed 4BC. Can you believe that?
Yeah.
I go in there all the time. We record ads all the time.
That's
there.
Wonderful. Yeah, well, 4BC, Vince and I.
Now it's called Magic FM or Magic
like
AM.
That, yeah.
Broke my heart.
When Vince Curry passed away, at a incredibly young age, at 50 years of age, I took over then and did them for the next 5 or 6 years, 4 or 5 years, with the great John McCoy, who was still is doing announcing and so forth on Fox and so forth. So and that went then. The Courier Mail asked me if I'd be interested in writing boxing and rugby league, so I started doing that. And then the ABC said, "Would I do a couple of nights a week on the ABC?" So I did that. And then Channel 9 started a Saturday afternoon sports program, and so I did 3 years with them as well. So I was on written media, and then the Ring magazine got in touch, so I wrote Ring magazine for boxing for about another 5 years with them. So I covered all facets, and from there it went, Drew, to doing the 1982 Commonwealth Games from Brisbane. I was asked through the ABC to. And Dennis Cometti, the great Aussie rules broadcaster, Dennis and I, were the joint announcers for Radio Australia, which went all over the world. And that was a bit scary. They said before we went to air the first time, they said, mate, good luck because we've got a conventional audience of about 3 billion people. And I thought, well, thanks for saying that. But it was great. And you wouldn't want to know, after the first fight I did, there was a little Australian involved in it named Rodney Harburger, and I'll never forget him. He was a little flyweight. The first fight we broadcast, he was an Australian from Melbourne. And I said, how good was that? And the outside broadcast fan, great, but you did call him a hamburger about 3 times instead of Harburger. And I said, you're kidding. And they played it back, and I did. So he became half hamburger and half Harburger. So, but that was the first. And then I eventually, from there, I virtually got the job with the Commonwealth Games again. And then I did the Goodwill Games, which was great. In Brisbane, the last Ted Turner's, when the Americans didn't go to the Olympic Games because of Russia and so forth. So he started his own games, and that was only the top 16 of every sport that was played. They were invited to do this Goodwill Games. So there was no someone from New Guinea fighting some from Cuba or something. They were the top 16 of each sport were virtually invited to in the final. So it was virtually the finals of every, the top grade. And I was proud to be the boxing announcer for Ted Turner's last games up in Brisbane, that was. And then, of course, the highlight to me was virtually the Olympic Games in Sydney, which was just incredible.
Magic.
Yeah. So it's a long history, yeah.
Yeah. And I want to ask you then, how, in your opinion, how has boxing changed? The actual, like for you to do 10 rounds. And by the way, how sharp are you now? Like so many people are now worried about, oh, you shouldn't spar too much. And I'm thinking about all the sparring you did back then and without any supervision or knowledge of consequences.
Exactly right. It's a bit like smoking, so you know it sort of really knew. But truly...
and glove technology too, I bet, was different.
Sure, because they were pretty hard in those days. You know, there was almost stuff with horsehair, you know, which was pretty hard. It was almost like bare knuckles, you know. But, Bobby Sin and I talk about how many rounds you boxed. Bobby and I, he's passed away now, but Bobby and I at one stage we were doing a talk show and we worked out we'd virtually boxed 1,000 rounds. Just the two of us, so I'd boxed a lot with other guys as well. So it's a lot of rounds, you know. Yeah. But we did have headgears on and so forth. And
really? Yeah.
Now that's a bit of a debatable point, Drew, whether headgears are good or bad, because pros now, senior amateurs, virtually have no headgear. So so they were almost working out that headgears can sort of be more damage than no headgear. So it's a bit of a...
It holds so much heat for one.
They do for a start, And I think they virtually... You know,
it's all the same.
The bodies that, you know, the powers that be are now looking to see if they'll continue with no headgear. So it's a changing world.
My dad was a big fan of Johnny Famazon, right? And just the way he'd move and he'd just step out of. But when you watch those fights, clearly something about styles seem to have changed. Yeah. You know, I want to know your opinion.
Famo was a freak. You know, he was just so good. And that was Ambrose Palmer's training. Ambrose Palmer's wasn't to get in there and try and knock the bloke out. Ambrose Palmer used to say, boxing is all about hitting but not being hit. And if you keep hitting the bloke and not being hit, you're going to win fights. It might knock them out, but Famo was that good. Someone was saying to me not that long ago, he said, I boxed a lot with Famo down in Melbourne. And he said, but when the round was over, he said, mate, you threw 300 punches at Famo and you nearly hit him once. And that's about how hard Famo was to hit. Yeah, he said, you nearly hit him once, I think.
So and he still looks fresh and dancing around.
Yeah, poor Famo is now doing it pretty tough. And that's why we've inducted him twice into the Hall of Fame, once for his boxing and once for his courage to get over, because he was run over jogging home from a racetrack where there were celebrities and a lot of boxers were there. And he said, mate, I need a bit of exercise. I'm going to, jog home. So he jogged home, jogged off a footpath and got run over by a car and is, doing it pretty tough at the moment. Right. But his wife Jenny is just an incredible lady. She looks after him 24 hours a day. He has a carer in and virtually has to have someone in as a physio sort of thing. Otherwise he'd probably die. Wow.
Where is he?
In Melbourne, yeah.
Okay.
But he comes up whenever he can. Mate, he is such a good little guy. We thought we'd get him we had a photo taken of him and his trainer and we blew it up and virtually got him to sign. We had 400 of them and we thought we might be able to make a bit of money for our association up here, which a lot of our money goes towards charities and so forth, particularly involved with boxing. But Famo, his wife said, Famo went to bed after 4 o'clock that morning, and I said, why? And he said there were 400 of those things, and he writes very slowly now because of his inflection, about his... But he signed every one of the 400 before he went to bed, and that's what Famo's like. He said, they've asked me to sign them, so I can't stop. And,
could you imagine?
That's Famo, yeah.
Just like your mate from the bowling club.
Yeah.
Fit blokes, and then next minute, particularly, Famo, if I can call him that.
Sure.
Being... Well, like everyone knows who he is, and they know him as being a fit. He's constantly like this, and then next minute you feel useless in a bed.
That's the sad part. His
mental,
mind is still, And I mean, the same as young Graham down here. This guy we inducted in, for his courage and determination, and he is virtually the most courageous person I've ever met. Don't worry about blokes over in Bangor, in wartime and so forth. He shows more courage. Virtually, he'd never played bowls, but he said, I can't play cricket, which he used to. I can't play this sport, which I used to. I can't do this. I'm paralysed down my entire right side. Bowls is the only thing I can do. And he spent 6 months virtually practising until he got it. Takes him 3 or 4 minutes to walk up the other end. No one says anything because they know just how courage he is. And that to me is real courage. Don't worry about guys getting in and fight Muhammad Ali. Yeah. I just think he shows more courage than some of the soldiers. Yeah.
And they don't. And it's good for people like yourselves to let them know how it affects us. Like,
sure.
Just like here,